Now we're going to tie a Letort Hopper. This is a simple little grasshopper pattern that can be tied in really small sizes up to relatively big. We're going to tie this one on a size 10 Tiemco 100 SP. We're going to use some 3/0 yellow monocord thread, some pale yellow superfine dubbing for the body, a turkey wing quill that's been varnished so that it won't separate for the wing, and a little bit of natural deer hair for the spun head and collar. This is a nice little fly because it can be tied small, and early season hoppers are relatively small size, much smaller than most of the hoppers that you'll see for sale in stores. I'm going to start the thread at about the midpoint or so on the hook. I'm going to make a thread base back to the bend, and I'll bring the thread forward again to about the middle of that thread base, and this is where I'll start my dubbing on the thread. We've got a little bigger fly here, and we're still using a fine dry fly style dubbing, so it's going to take a little more than we've become used to so far. But we still want to make sure it's dubbed on tightly, even though it's in a little heavier layer. You can see how I'll feed that down as I go, just making a proportion sized layer of dubbing that's still tied on the thread. I'll work back to the bend and try to get my first turn of dubbing right back here at the back of the hook. And I'll work forward from there. I want to stop this dubbing right where we started our thread, which is just in front of the halfway point. Then I'll work back again to fatten the body up a bit and end up here at the front end, hopefully with bare thread, just right. So we've got a nice robust body on this fly. We don't want it too skinny. I'm going to run the thread all the way up to the hook eye now and back to the front edge of the body to give us a thread base so that our wing won't slide around when we tie it in. Now, as I said, what we've got here is a turkey wing quill. It's got some really pretty modeling on it, and I've coated this with Flexament as well. I'm going to take and cut one of these segments out. It's about as wide as the gap of the hook. I'm going to tie this in with the butt end facing backwards. So that's the end that we're going to shape into our wing. So I'm going to fold that feather, and I'm going to trim from the loose end down. So rather than a notch, I've got a V shape. I'm going to lay this in on top of the fly body, and I'm going to let the wing extend a little bit past the bend of the hook, maybe half a shank past the bend of the hook, and I'll pinch that feather so it folds around the hook shank and over the body, and get a couple of loose turns of thread before I tighten them down so it'll curl down around the sides of the fly. Makes a nice little tent wing styled body, and then I'll wrap over those butt ends to further anchor that down. I'll trim out the extra. Check both sides, looks good. I'm going to smooth off my thread base now because we're going to spin some deer hair on the top of this. Now I'm going to take a clump of just natural white-tailed deer hair here, and I like to tie my deer hair flies relatively heavy. A little more hair on the fly makes it float better and longer, so I'm going to take a relatively heavy clump to start with, and I've got to still clean it out yet. But this first bunch I want to pay particular attention to the tips because I'm going to use the tips as a collar on this fly. So I want to make sure that I've got some short, nice tips that will kind of blend in with the overall color scheme of this whole fly. And I'll take this hair and stack it up in my stacker. Like so. So I've got a nice clean little bunch of hair here. But rather than work with the whole length of this hair, you can see how long it is, I'm not going to need that much. So I'm going to cut some of it off just to make this bunch of hair a little easier to work with. So I'm going to get rid of some of these butt ends. I'm going to come back in and measure the tips of this hair so they're just short of the bend of the hook. And they're certainly short of the bend of the end of the wing here. I'm going to take this clump of hair, I'm going to lay it in on top of the hook. I'm going to put 3 turns of thread around it, and I'm going to pull the thread toward me to flare that hair. You can see this hair is very hollow. It's got a thin wall diameter and a thin wall thickness and a large inside diameter. So that hair will really flare when I cinch it down with the thread. Now rather than let this bunch of hair spin all the way around the hook, I'm going to hold those tips on top to keep them up where we want them and I'm going to work my thread forward in small increments through these butt ends to distribute those butt ends around the hook. I've worked about half the distance we had forward on the hook shank there, and I'll push the rest of this hair back, exposing just a little bit of the hook shank at the front, and I can jump my thread right in front of that bunch of hair there. Now I'm going to add one more smaller bunch of hair to the front end of this just to pack things in just a bit tighter. So I'll take another small clump of hair, clean it out, and in this case I don't need the tips, I'm more concerned with the butt ends. The butt ends are the largest diameter part of the hair, so I'm going to try to use as much of that as I can. That larger diameter hair will flare a little easier. I'll trim the tips off, so I've just got about a ½ inch long bundle of deer hair here. I'm going to pull this back and I'm going to put the center of that clump of hair right even with where my thread's hanging. It's sort of overlapping the first bunch. And I'll put 2 turns around this bunch and start to flare that hair. I'm going to move my fingers out of the way a little bit here. I do want to hold onto the hook while I do this. I've just flared that hair. I'm going to pull the thread and let it distribute that hair around the hook. You can see how I'll just keep working forward through that hair to get it to spin 360 degrees around the hook shank. That's going to give us a nice full deer hair head. You can also see that some of that hair is flared out in front of the hook eye. That's just fine. We actually want that. That's going to make a nice face for a square head on the front of our hopper. I'm going to twist that hair back just a bit and jump the thread forward to just behind the hook eye where I'll whip finish. So as I come in to do this, I want to catch the thread in the corner of the hook eye. I'm going to need just a bit more room to do this, so I'm going to pack this back one more time. That's more like it. Pull that hair back out of the way and just get a few turns in there for our whip finish, and then I can trim my thread. Now to trim this fly, I like to use a double-edged razor blade. These are stainless blades and they're crazy sharp, so you've got to be really careful with them. And what I'll do with them is break them in half, so I've only got one side to worry about cutting me at a time. This is going to make trimming the fly much easier. I'll try to do some of this in the vise. Usually I'll just hold this in my hand, but I'm going to turn the fly upside down to start with. I'm just going to push the blade right through the hair across the bottom of the fly. And you can see how sharp these blades are, because that hair just jumps right off the hook. Like I say, typically I'd hold this in my fingers to do it, so I've got a little better control, but I want you to see what's going on here. Some of those hairs that are sticking forward, I'm going to take my blade straight up the front edge and just sort of trim that edge flat. And now I am going to have to turn the fly a little bit here, because the trick on trimming the head is going to be to take this razor blade and I'm going to buckle it in the middle to fold it in half. I can get a real tight little fold here. I'm going to push right in through that deer hair back to the collar. I don't want to cut those natural tips off. I just want to cut the butt ends of the hair. And you can see how I can push that radius blade in and get a nice rounded head shape. Trim off a few loose ends here. The closer you cut to the hook shank, the tighter this hair will be packed. But you want to make sure that you leave some of the hair on the hook, because that'll add more flotation to the fly. You set him back up in the vise here so you can get a little better look at him. And I'll come in with my scissors just to clean up those cuts. Kind of square off the edges a bit. Any loose ends that I missed with the blade. Any hairs that I've got on the bottom of the fly, I'll just come in and trim flush. I want to have an exposed body on the bottom of the fly, but that deer hair collar on top, and you can see how that veils back over the wing. One of the most intriguing things about deer hair flies is knowing when to quit. The fly as it is right now will catch fish just fine. I tend to trim and trim and trim until they're perfect, but that'll do just fine. That's a pretty nice square little head. I like to keep a square-shaped head that's a little more imitative of a real hopper. That's our Letort Hopper. Nice, easy little fly, easy to tie in small sizes or big sizes, and the fly still works. It'll cross for a caddis, a hopper, even a little yellow Sally Stonefly.